Oh, okay. So here's the setup. When I'm working with a Rails application, I typically have more than one command prompt window open, often two or three. The main reason is one of them is almost always just exclusively running the Rails server, and I don't want to have to interrupt it, right? I don't want to have to close the server in order to do things like run the Rails scaffolding or generators or whatnot. So I've already started here with two. The other one is now not only going to be used for running Rails stuff, but I'm also going to use it for running Git stuff. So as I run my Git commits, they're going to happen in here as well. When I tend to have three is I might have one, if I'm doing test-driven development, I might have one console which is perpetually looking for changes to my files and running the associated tests. I'm not going to be doing test-driven development for this particular demo though. So we start a Rails project by asking the Rails app, and I'm just going to check what version I have of Rails on here. Okay, that's good. That's the latest version of Rails. Rails new is my command to start a new Rails project. And here's going to be my to-do list demo. So running Rails new is simply going to build the file folder structure that is Rails. So all Rails apps follow the same structure. The structure has not changed much since I've been around. So there's been a few changes since I think I came to Rails in like the 2.0 days. There was a few changes to the structure, but the structure itself, especially the app folder, has stayed pretty consistent over time. And when you run the new command, not only does it create a bunch of files and folders for you, it also makes sure that you have all of the required versions of the gems that Rails depends upon. So Rails is not just one library, it's a collection of libraries. And we saw this because we were able to work with Active Record outside the context of Rails, because Active Record itself was a gem. And so when Rails runs, it creates a file here called a gem file, and we can look at that. This was work from the other section here, so I'll close that all up. It creates a gem file which lists all of the gems that Rails needs and which versions of them are required. And then it runs something called bundle from the command line that goes and fetches all of the gems. And any one of these gems might depend on other gems. And so if we actually look at what's called the gemfile.lock, this is actually a list of all of the gems that were pulled into our system, because requiring one might then depend on others, and so the gem environment is a dependency environment where all those dependencies are managed by the gem program itself. So Rails is a collection of this many different gems. There's a lot of them. A lot of them are maintained separately from the Rails core team. So it's like almost like web development as Lego, right? You're taking all of these pieces and putting them together to make something called Rails. And so there you go. I've built my Rails project. I can now CD to that project, right? So CD to-do list demo. And at this point, I want to git enable it. So I say git init. Sorry, git init dot to enable the current folder. And now I can go back to my GitHub repository, which is this one here, and add this remote so that I can push my Git commits to GitHub. And now I can say, well, add any outstanding changes to the staging area. Okay. All those warnings are just because I tend to work across multi-platforms, so I typically have it warn me about line endings, because the line feed endings are different in Windows environments from Linux environments, and you can have Git sort of auto-convert for you if necessary. I just haven't set things up properly, or so I'm getting a whole bunch of warnings, but that's okay. And I can commit, I can say initial commit of the new to-do Rails app. and then I can do a git push -u origin master, and that will ask me. Oh, I haven't set up my. Now I'm not going to know what my password is because I auto-generate all my passwords. That's fine. Let's sure. Let's get my password. GitHub. That should do it. Cool. Okay, so now I have my app up on GitHub, so that as I make changes to it, I'll be able to push them to GitHub, and then at the end of class today, you'll all be able to go to this particular repository on GitHub and either download a zip or clone it by way of the command line tools or the the GUI tools that are available from GitHub. The other command prompt that I have running here, I'm also going to cd to my to-do list demo, and I'm going to run the Rails server. So Rails space server does that. There are shortened forms of all of the Rails subcommands, and so you might see me, instead of running Rails server, you might see me running Rails S instead, which is just the same thing. As an aside, the password manager that I use, I love it. LastPass is so wonderful, or any password manager is so wonderful. Now I finally have different passwords for every site that I use on the internet, and I didn't used to. I used to just I had one password which I called my secure password, and I used it on things like banking, and then I had another password that I used elsewhere. It was awful. It was an awful setup, but I had those passwords memorized, and now I don't know anything other than my LastPass master password, which if I ever forget, I'm totally out of luck. And then I get it to generate really long, strong passwords for me. So like 15 to 20 character passwords for everything, which is nice. And if I go over to someone else's house, I can just load up LastPass on their computer and I have access to all my passwords or on my phone. It's really, really great. Highly recommend it or OnePass or any of the other password managers. It feels safer. And it audits your passwords for you too, which is a neat thing. Okay, by this point we should have launched our Rails server. For the server that's built into Rails, we're not using something like Apache or Nginx here. We're using something called WebBrick. And what WebBrick is a HTTP server written in Ruby. And so it just comes packaged with Rails, giving you the ability to, while you're developing, just bring up quickly an HTTP server, interact with it, and when you're done, turn it off. And so it launches itself on localhost at port 3000. So instead of using the standard port 80, it uses 3000 so as to not conflict with any other potential web service that you might have on your machine. And so to access it, I can now go to localhost at 3000. And what I'll see is this welcome page. And this is typically what I do every time I set up a new Rails application, just to make sure the whole setup process worked and my server's working. And so you can see the server has processed that GET request, and it sent some data to me, which is specifically just this HTML welcome aboard page. I can click on this link, and I get a bunch of information about the environment in which this application is being run. Things like the version of Ruby it's using, and the version of Rails it's using, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's nice. So this worked. I can be happy, and I can sort of proceed. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a model and a database table for my tasks. And so if I was using scaffolding, I would run a Rails generator for scaffolding and have it not only generate my model, but also generate the associated controller and views. But I want to do things sort of step by step here. So I'm going to say Rails G for generate, although I could type out generate in full. And what do I want to generate? It's a model. And the model, it represents what? A task. And what is a task? Well, I've said that a task is simply going to be a description, which is going to be of type text. And that's it. And so I should be able to hit enter here, and two things will happen. One, the model is going to be placed in the app models folder, and it'll be a task model. And there'll also be a migration that's generated, and a migration is just a description of what the tasks database table needs to look like. So I get two things out of the model generator. I get the ability to create my database table and the model that is mapped to that database table. Rails also builds some tests for me because Rails programmers really are into sort of that idea of test-driven development. We're not going to be looking at those today, but you can see they were created. And the ones that we are going to be looking at specifically are these two, the app models task and the db migrate file. So I'm going to open up both of those inside of Komodo just to see what they look like. App models task and db migrate and the migration file. In the db folder, you can also see that this is where our database is. This is the development.sqlite3 file. Currently, it is a 0-byte file. There's nothing in our database at this point. It's an empty file. The model doesn't look like anything yet, right? It just says class task. So we're defining a class called task with a capital T, inheriting from active record base. And because of this inheritance, we get all of the things that come with being an active record model. And so one of those things being this class is auto-magically mapped to the tasks database table. And that's by convention, right? So when we create tables that are pluralized nouns, typically, the associated model is the singularized version of that word capitalized. This is just a convention that happens across Rails. It's always the same. We always have pluralized database table names and singular capitalized. Yes, exactly. It allows us to access that particular table. Okay, and we don't need to add anything to here yet, but maybe we will. Let's add one validation. So we can say validates that the our only column description has a presence of true, meaning that we cannot save a task as an empty task. We always want there to be some kind of description associated with it, even if it's a single character. We just want it to be present. I'm now going to run my migration because just because I have this file doesn't mean that I have a tasks table yet. You can see within this file, there is a command that says create table tasks, where the table is going to have a description column, which is a text column, the timestamps are created at and updated at timestamps, and not mentioned here, we will also get a primary key called ID, which will be like an auto-incrementing primary key. And that comes with all Rails tables, and they're always called ID. And so to run this migration, we go to the command prompt again, and there's two different commands that we run in Rails. There's the Rails command, which typically is used for things like generators. And then there's the rake command, which runs tasks that are associated with particular types of tasks. So rake has a bunch of database tasks that it can work with. And so we prefix our task with db:, and then the specific task that we want to run is db: migrate. What this task does is it looks to the migration folder for any new migration files, and it runs them. It knows they're new because of this long numeric value here, which if you look at it carefully is a timestamp, right? 2014, 10th month, 31st day, followed by some time. So that's a timestamp. And so Rake knows which migrations have been run and which haven't. So by running this, it'll find an outstanding migration, it'll run it, and now I will have a tasks database table to work with. And we'll see in my folder here, this 0 kilobytes file that I have, which is my development.sqlite3, is probably going to jump up to about 5 kilobytes once this migration actually runs. And there you go, 5 kilobytes. A new file also just appeared in this folder, which is the schema.rb file. So if you ever get confused as to what your database schema looks like, you can open up this schema.rb file, and it sort of looks like a migration, but eventually it'll contain a description of all the different tables that exist in your system. So right now, it just has a create table in it for tasks, and it talks about the description and the created at and updated at. Eventually, if we start adding more and more tables to our system, we'll see them all defined in here with all their columns listed, and this is that timestamp that was run. So now you can see it's the same timestamp here. So now the next time we run rakedb migrate, it knows not to rerun the create tasks one because it's already been run. The really cool thing about having migrations is you make changes to your database over time, and you capture those changes in your version control over time, so that if you ever have to go back to a particular version of your database as it existed in the past, there's rakedb migrate commands that you can run to step you back in time. So for example, if I just realized that I did not want to create this database table, maybe I messed up my whole Rails model command, I could run rakedb migrate version equals 0, and that'll step me back to a time before the tasks table even existed. And so it'll remove that tasks table for me. So if I let that run, it'll go and it basically goes and runs all executed migrations in reverse. So if the migration contains a create table statement, the reverse of that is drop table. And so drop table got executed. Now my tasks are gone. Not necessarily what I wanted. I just wanted to demo that though. And so I can run it again and it'll re-invoke the migration. You always want to see something output when you run rakedb migrate. db migrate has a bad habit of, if there's an error in your migration or if your migration fails, it doesn't tend to display an error message. You just don't get any output. You run the command and nothing happens. And so if you're expecting there to be a change to your database, you want to see some output from rakedb migrate. It'll also show you nothing if you just run it again. So it's like it also outputs nothing if there is no migrations to be run. So if I let this execute, it'll go check, okay, are there any outstanding migrations? No, there aren't, so I have nothing to do. And you can see I'm using my old computer, so everything goes a lot slower than my faster new computer. And so there you go, nothing output because there was no outstanding migrations. Okay, so we have a model and we have a database table. We don't yet have anything to interact on the web side of things, but we can already start interacting with the model and the database table using another Rails command. And the Rails command is the Rails console command, or Rails C for short. Or no, not CO. Yeah, not recognized, sorry. That's fine, yes. I just want Rails C. What the Rails console is an IRB prompt, a interactive Ruby prompt that has access to all of our Rails project and lets us just interactively type in Ruby and have it execute. And so when it loads up, what we're going to see is we're going to be able to interact with our task model and already start adding tasks to our database just to give ourselves some sort of test content to that database table, so that once we start writing the web version of, or the web accessible side of this app, we'll have some tasks to work with. And so that's another reason why I often have multiple console windows open, is because I might have one running the Rails console. So now I have one running the Rails console, one running the Rails server, which means I'll probably need to go back and open another one up over here. And it's about time for me to do some Git work. So I do a Git status. We see the different files. They're hard to read because they're in red, but it's Git has detected that there's a new app models task file, that there's a new folder called db migrate, there's a new file called db schema, and the tests as well. And so I can stage those changes, I can commit them and say added the task model and associated tasks db table, and I can push that to GitHub, and again it wants my username and password. If it gets annoying to you to always put in your username and password, you can go to the Git help section and set up public-private key authentication, where you define a cryptographic key that you store on your computer, and there's two sides to a cryptographic key. There's a public side and a private side. You put the public side up on GitHub and you associate it with your account, and from that point on you don't need to provide your username and password anymore. The cryptographic key does the authentication for you. It's a very nice setup. Okay, so back at my other window here, my console is still running. That's awful. Why haven't you started? Is my computer really this slow? Could be. Okay, well let's do this. Or are you just not running at all? Rails console. While we're letting that run, I'd like to describe the aspects of what I'd like to happen on the web side of things. I would like it so that when I load up localhost at port 3000, I no longer see this welcome to Rails screen. I'd like to see a list of all of the tasks in my system. I'd like the root of my web page to be the task index, the index of all tasks. And so for that, I'm going to start to have to build the web-facing portions of my Rails application, which are I'm going to have to interact with the routing file, I'm going to have to interact with a controller, and that controller is going to interface with my model that already exists, and I'm going to need at least one view to get going. Okay, so the console actually did run. I wonder why it didn't run properly when I typed Rails CN, but it did run when I typed in Rails console. This is the interactive Ruby prompt. So, 4 plus 4 tells me 8. 21 times puts chunky bananas. You get 21 chunky bananas. It's just Ruby, right? And I can define methods here. I can define variables here. I often just come to my console to sort of prototype things, to test things out. But I can also access my models of my system, which is really powerful. So I could do like a task.new to see what like a task object does, and look, it automatically runs inspect for me. So I can sort of inspect what a task looks like. I could create a new task, so I could say first task equals task.new, and I could start modifying that task to give it a description. Finish the Rails lecture is my first task. Wrong number. Oh, I have to use an equal sign to assign it, of course. And then I can go to my first task and save it. And now if I do something like task.count, I can see that there's one task in my database. I could do like task.first, and I could get access to that task. And because I'm in Windows 7, I don't get color coding here, so all of these weird little arrows would typically be where the output was nicely color coded. I've noticed they brought back color coding to Windows in Windows 8. It was present before 7s, it disappeared during 7, and now it's back in version 8. So if I was running on my other machine, you'd see these things being sort of nicely color coded rather than full of weird arrows and escape characters. They just take it in and out every version, eh? Did you see that version 10's getting a command line package manager like apt-get? That's pretty interesting. Okay, so that's why I like my console. I can interact with my models in a sort of typing kind of way, and now I can add a bunch of tasks so that I have some data to work with. So, yeah, what's up?
Is it actually adding it to your database?
It's actually adding it to my database, yeah. So it's not like I'm not sort of mocking it out here. It's actually like if we were looking at the SQLite database file, we would slowly see it even grow in size. And so it actually is adding it to my database, which is great because now I want to start building up the web-facing portion of my app, and I want there to be some data in there. So another description, peanut butter jelly time. And then that should create that task. And I'll just create a third one. Description, done for the day, go home.
Sounds good.
And now we have 2, there should be 3. Which one failed? Or did I do a .new instead of a .create for one of them? I think I did. Yeah. So pushing the up arrow allows you to sort of revisit the commands that were present, and I can go to the one where I didn't properly actually save it, and I can change it from a new to a create, and I can run it, and now my task.count should be 3, and it is. Okay, so I'll leave the console up and running. The only thing to be aware of that's special about the console is that if you make changes to your model, you have to run reload ! To have it pull those changes in. So it basically looks at your model files only when it first starts up. And the other thing I guess I can show you is that if I was to create a task that was invalid, like according to my validations, so an invalid task equals just plain old task.new, I would not be able to save this invalid task because it does not pass my validations. So you see false was returned to me when I tried to save it. And then I could look at invalid task.errors, and I could see that there was a message in those errors telling me that the description can't be blank. So I can look to my validations also from the console. Okay, so now I have some test data that I can work with. I need a controller, so I'm going to generate one. I'm going to say Rails generate controller, and I'm going to call it tasks. We typically name our controllers after the resource that we're working with, and the resource in this case is our database table called tasks. So I'm going to name my controller after that. Once I've typed in the name of the controller, I can also type in the names of any controller actions that I know I'm going to need. I can always add more later, but at least I know straight up that I'm going to need an index one. So I could add that there, but I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible. So we'll build that all from scratch. So I'm just going to say generate a controller. Don't build anything else auto-magically for me at this point in time. So this will create a few more files. Some of them will be test files. Some of them will actually be the controller itself. If I had specified any actions, then this would also have created a few views for me. As it stands, it created a subfolder inside of the app views folder for any tasks related views. So at least I have a place to put my views that are associated with this tasks controller. So again, this becomes part of learning Rails, is the file structure of Rails. And so in the app folder, I have this tasks controller that's in the controllers subfolder, and in the views subfolder, I now have a tasks, which is where the views that are paired with that tasks controller go. I'm going to go open up that controller, which is right here. I'm going to create, I'm going to go to my routing file as well. And initially the routing file is full of a bunch of comments to give you some indications as to what to do. What I would like to do, as I said, is I'd like to make it so that when I go to just plain old root of my folder, that I get to see all my tasks. So I need to create a route for the root. And to do that, I say root, and then in side of quotes, I name the controller that I want to route to, and I name the action that I wish to route to, which is going to be called index. So I'm going to say when the root is loaded, so basically I get request to slash is what's going to trigger this, loads the index action of the tasks controller. So an HTTP GET to the root folder loads that. If I was just to run this right now, the root would get recognized, but it would send an error saying there is no action called index. Okay, so step one, and this is sometimes how you can build a Rails app when you're new to it. It's sort of Rails will lead you, hopefully, as to what you need to do next, right? So I've set up my route, I run it, it says, okay, well now I'm missing that actual action in the task controller. Okay, so an action is just a method. So I can go and add that method, def index, doesn't take any parameters, just an empty method. Oh, well, what's missing now? A template is missing. Missing template, task index, and then a bunch of stuff that's not necessarily all that relevant to us, but it tells us where it looked for it. Searched in the app views folder. So we now need to make a index view so I can go into my app views folder. This view has to do with the tasks controller, so I go in there and I make a new file which I call index.html.erb. Double file extension. So it's going to contain embedded Ruby, but that's going to then get compiled down to plain old HTML. So we name it twice. What you really want to do when working with Rails is you want to make sure that when you create these files from Windows Explorer, you're not just creating plain old text files. The easiest thing to do is to always make sure that Windows is set up to display the file extensions of known types. So notice I've taken the check mark away from hide extensions of known file types, and I did that from the folder options. That way you can always go in and say create new text file, but then just rename the whole file, including the text extension. So just an easy way of creating empty documents rather than using your editor to do so. Okay, so now I have this index. Finally, I should be able to run this, and I get a blank screen. If I view source, you'll see that the document itself isn't actually empty, just the body of the document is. All of this stuff is coming from my application layout. And so where's that? That's in the app views layouts folder here. So you can see this title is to-do list demo without spaces. Maybe I want to add spaces to that. And maybe at the top of all pages, I'm going to have a header that has an H1 in it that says to-do list. And so now I can go back here, reload the source. You can see the spaces were added to the title. I now have that header here. And so if I reloaded the actual rendered version of the page, we see that. So the layout is shared across all of our views. And so even when we have an empty view, our view's empty, we can still see something in the browser, but that something's coming from the layout. Okay, so how do we actually see all of our tasks? The goal here was that I wanted my root to load up this index. So that's working, right? So if you again look at or think about the diagram that I went over earlier, this one here, we've set up the routing, we've set up the controller, we have a model, we have a view, we have a layout. It's time to write some embedded Ruby and some HTML in the view to actually make this happen. And we also are going to need to stage the data that we want access to inside of the controller. Now it might be tempting to do something like this. So here's some embedded Ruby. First, I'll just show some straight up embedded Ruby. So I could do something like 21 times again, do, and now inside of, let's say, h2 tags, I'm going to say chunky banana. And then go back over here and notice what I'm doing. I'm jumping back and forth between ERB and HTML. I don't need a put statement anymore. We don't use puts inside of our views at all anymore. All we do is we just leave ERB mode and start writing plain old HTML. This is what makes ERB very, very powerful, is that we can use it to loop over or conditionally add chunks of HTML. So now I should have a document in which ERB has embedded 21 H2s for me. So if I go back to, there it is. Would I like to translate this page? Yes, let's see what you translated to. The page has been translated. Wonderful. That's Google being its most helpful. I can now read chunky banana in my native language. And if we looked at the view source again, there'd be those, all those H2s. So you can embed Ruby directly inside of here, and you could have it do stuff. Now, what if you wanted this to be a little bit more flexible? What if you wanted maybe this chunky banana to have been defined inside of the controller? So let's say I do something like this, chunky something. That's not going to run because that variable doesn't exist. So it just is empty. But I can now go into my tasks controller and I can define chunky something to be chunky banana. So it's like I stage my data here. The instance variables get automatically handed off, breaking object-oriented encapsulation, right? So we're throwing out a tenet of object orientation for just a helpful feature in that this gets automatically handed off to my view. And so some people get a little upset about that aspect of Rails, that the encapsulation sort of magically goes away in certain cases. And now, if all of that has been set up properly,
You misspelled chunky something on your index.
Haha, okay. Oh, yeah, forgot the E, thank you. And so now we see that, right? We go back to the controller and we could change that. We could even make it somewhat dynamic. We could say something like, if some random number from 0 to 1 is 0. So pick two random numbers. Then I could set up my chunky banana to be two different things. It could be like if it's 0, be chunky banana. Else, it could be chunky bacon. And now bacon, 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 bacon. Did I do this wrong? Banana! That's randomness for you. Okay. So now we get some dynamic nature to our page without clouding up our view. And so this is the same kind of thing that I ask of my PHP students. We want to keep our views really as like templating things, right? They can loop, they can inject data, they can maybe have some decisions in them, but you want to remove as much Ruby as possible from the view. And in this case, I've put it into the controller. Another place where we could potentially have put it, if this was a real application that had something to do with chunkiness, we might put it off in a model, right? We might have a model method that picked this for us. The other tempting thing that we sometimes wish we could do but we should never do is this. We don't want to say, okay, like task.all right in here, .each, and then, oh no, not chunky banana, do Come on, autocomplete, leave me alone. Do task. This is going to work, but it's not necessarily what I want. So I'll move all of these chunky things to the bottom of the document. And then up here, I'll put in, I'll leave this. These are just going to be my tasks, and I'm going to, let's say, I'll make a unordered list of tasks, each one inside of an LI, and then I can use my embedded Ruby echo statement to output the task description. So I'm accessing my model directly here. I'm saying model.all.each, loop over each one, call it tasks, and inject that into my document inside of an LI. So for every task that's in my system, I'll get one LI with a different description inside of it. Oh, no, don't do that. And I can go back to my content, and look, there's my tasks. But again, that's asking the view to do too much. We don't want our views to even know about the fact that we're working with Active Record. We don't want our views to even care about the fact that we have a database behind us. The views are supposed to be as dumb as possible. And they're also supposed to be isolated from potential changes in technology. So there's a chance that somewhere down the line, I change from using Active Record to a different type of ORM, and I don't want to have to go and modify all my views just because I made that change. So your view should never talk to the model. Just imagine that the view and the model are people and they really dislike each other. Or maybe they were really good friends at one point and now they're in an argument and they go to the controller to talk to each other. So the controller sort of acts as that in-between, right? The view says, controller, tell the model I really don't want to talk to them right now. And the controller says, okay. So that's what we'll do here. We'll load up tasks and just have that task.all here in the controller. And then inside of the view, because we have access to all of the instance variables that the controller makes, I can now say task.all. So I've removed the knowledge of the model from the view, but the functionality is the same. The controller now loads up all of my tasks, whereas the view loads up not from the model, but from that tasks variable. I've done something wrong. You got it. Instead of all. Right, because I actually have to loop them. There they are. And now I could do things like from the controller, I could do things like I could order these things alphabetically, right? I could say task.order by description. And so if it was important for me to be able to see these tasks in alphabetical order, there they are. If I had a lot of tasks and I only wanted to display a few of them, maybe I might order them and limit them. I only have 2, so maybe I'll just show you I can limit it to, I think I have 3, so I can limit it to 2 to get rid of one of them. Peanut butter jelly time goes away. So you can do all your Active Record-y stuff here, building up the data that you want to hand off to the view. We've now seen the sort of the full flow. We've seen every part of this. I set up a routing file to define a route. If I ever want to know, eventually I'll have a whole bunch of routes in my system. There's a rake task that shows me what my routes are. I can run rake routes and it'll list all of the routes for me that exist in my system. And it's basically a listing of which URLs map to which controller actions. And with large applications, you tend to need to know that because you don't always remember all of the routes that exist in your system. So in my routing file, I configured a route. So that was box number 1. That route pointed to a particular controller action. So I needed to generate that controller and build that action. The controller spoke with the model, which was the go-between to the database. that's what was happening right here. So that's my staging area for data. And then any of the instance variables defined in the controller were then handed off to the view. The view then was passed to ERB, and all of the embedded Ruby code was executed. And then the view was embedded inside of the layout, because the view is just the body of the HTML document, but it gets embedded right where this yield word is. It's yielding to the view here. And then finally, after that layout had the view injected into it, that was handed back off to the WebRick server, which was sent by way of HTTP over TCP/IP to my browser, allowing me to actually see the page.
How the view gets injected automatically?
The view gets injected automatically, and it also gets loaded automatically. So this, by way of the name here, the fact that this was called index, what happens is the associated view is now automatically loaded. And the associated view in this case is the app views tasks index.html.erb. So because this thing is named index, that's why this view was loaded. And then after this view is loaded, it gets automatically injected into this layout. We don't have to do anything for either of those steps. So if we start to create other actions, those other actions are going to have associated views that are named after them as well. So a lot of stuff happens, and Rails programmers tend to call it happens auto-magically, right? So it just sort of happens for you, and you have to get comfortable with the Rails magic, and you have to sort of know when Rails does things for you auto-magically and when you have to do them yourself. Any other questions about just this, either this sort of life cycle of a Rails request, or any of the things that I've just coded? The fact that I've added this route here, this controller action, this layout, and this view. Okay, so I think I'm going to build up one more controller action, or at least start with doing that. And this time I'm going to make it a member action. What we have here is a collection action. It's a collection action. So here, this is a collection action which loads all tasks. It's a collection action because it loads up a collection of tasks, right? It's not just focused on one particular task. It's loading a collection of tasks. Member actions, on the other hand, are going to focus on one particular task identified by way of the task's primary key in the database. And so, like, this is a Rails application right here, my notes. Show 40. What is 40? Well, 40 is the primary key of course pack number 40 in the database. And so there's an S5 controller, a show action inside of it, and 40 being the ID that I want to load up. For my application here, let's say I wanted to have a specific page for each one of my to-do items. Maybe my application's growing, and eventually I'm going to allow for commenting on these tasks and flagging them as done or not done. So I want to be able to have a particular page for each one of them. And I'd like the URL for this, or the URI for the pages, to look like this: task/some ID, some numeric value. I'd like to be able to go to task/1 and see this one, which was the first task that I added to my system. I'd like to be able to go to task number 2 and see this one. So I need to first define this route, and it's a member route because it's pointing to a particular member of the tasks resource. And so I'll start with the routing file, and I'm I'm going to define a route, and this is when we have to be a little bit more familiar with HTTP. So HTTP, the protocol, has a number of verbs that it works with, and we saw when I was talking earlier about sort of the life cycle of a HTTP request that the most common of these verbs is get. So the root route is special in that we have this keyword root that we can map to a particular controller action. We can also do something like this. I can say, when we receive a GET request to /tasks/SumID, and I put in a symbol as a sort of a placeholder for that particular thing, I would like that to route to, like this, the tasks controller's show action. This word index and this word show here are again Rails conventions. When we have a page that is a member page that's simply for showing some kind of member of a particular type of resource, we just always call it show. When we're listing all of the collection, we call it index. These are just things that you have to start to memorize. So we have a show and an index. Here's a new route that has been defined. And so this is saying that a HTTP GET request to /tasks/some numeric value loads the show action of the tasks controller. If I go back to my command prompt here, when I ran rake routes earlier, I didn't show you what it came out to because it was taking a while to run. But what you can see is it showed me this. The more routes you get, it sort of more looks like a table. This is the prefix column, this is the verb column, this is the URI pattern column, and this is the controller action column. And so now that I've added a new route to my system, there will be two entries in the routing sort of table that's displayed when we run rake routes. The first one's still going to be the root route. The second one is going to be this newly defined route that I've defined right here. And there it is. Get tasks ID. This extra part here, parentheses, means that this thing is optional, so we can have an optional format. And that's because our views don't always need to be HTML views. We can make applications in Rails where this loads up the HTML representation of task 1, where this loads up the XML representation of task 1, and where this opens up the JSON JavaScript object notation representation of task 1. So we can have different views depending on the data types that we wish to work with. And what that gives us the ability of doing is building not only a website, but a web API at the same time. So you have multiple representations of the same resource. So that's why this format's here. But you can see that a GET request to /task/SumID is going to load up the show action of the tasks controller. So if I try to now run this URL, again, it's going to prompt me as to what I need to do next. There is no show action to be found in the task controller. Oh, before I even go any further, I should probably put some of this stuff into version control. This is all the stuff that was added when I added my tasks controller. So I've been a little lazy as far as keeping up with my git pushes. So added a tasks controller with an index collection action associated route and view to. Notice that I had to type 2 sentences there to describe my commit. That was an indication that I had waited too long to commit. You typically want your commits to be describable in a single sentence so that you're actually capturing each sort of small change that you make to your project. Okay, I'm missing a show, so I'm going to go here. I'm going to make it def show, and initially it'll just be empty. And I'm going to say this is a member action which loads a single task. And at the bottom of it, what's going to happen is the associated view is now loaded, where the associated view is now app views tasks show.html.erb, which doesn't yet exist, so I will make it. Here I am in the app view tasks folder. I will now make a show view. Like so. And I will open it up in here. Going back to my browser. Good, no errors, but no data. And so what I need to do is I need to load up the task and display it. Initially, let's gloss over how I know which task to display. Let's just say I load a task. In this case, just the first one. Right? Plain old active record, find the first task, save it into a task variable. This task variable is now accessible inside of the view. So that's also something I should mention here. When the index, the view has access to the tasks and chunky something instance vars. And in this case, the view has access to the task variable. So in my show view, I could now do something like inside of a paragraph tag, I could display the tasks description. Very simple view. And it needs to be at tasks, at task. So inside of a paragraph tag, simply display the description of the task at hand, the task that was loaded up by the show action. I haven't yet brought into the picture the fact that I'm going to be specifying by way of the URL which task I want to load. So any of these URLs all lead to the same task, which is the first task. Even if I did something like this, woot. So the final piece of this puzzle is figuring out how to get this ID into my controller. And this is a placeholder, and notice it's a symbol, right? I've put a colon in front of it. It's colon ID. For the PHP students, you've been used to working with the get superglobal and the post superglobal, which is where HTTP parameters end up. Rails has something where it combines both of those together, and it's called the params hash. And so if I want to find a task by ID, the command I use is the find command. Right? I say find, and I can give some numeric ID. So this will always find the task with a primary key of 1. So if I go back over here, loads it up. But I don't want to just find 1. I want to find the one that was defined inside of my route. So what I do is I use this word here, this symbol ID, and I use it with the params hash. I just say params at position ID. And the data from that route is going to be there. And so now whatever numeric value was in my URL is now going to be used as an argument to find, and it will load up the appropriate task. And if I pass it something like woot, it's not going to find anything at all. Couldn't find a task with an ID of woot. Makes sense. Number 1, first Rails lecture. Number 2, peanut butter jelly time. Number 3, done for the day. Number 4 doesn't exist. So again, could not find it. It makes sense that when a numeric value comes in, it doesn't find it. Rails also has multiple modes. In development mode, you get to see a nice little development task or a dashboard here where you actually see the code in question that caused the problem. You can look at like stack traces. You can actually peer at what that params hash looks like. So here's the params hash right here. You can even look at things like session, whatnot. In production mode, a active record not found would automatically trigger a 404 error to be sent to your end user. So they wouldn't, when you were in production on a Rails application, so here's a production Rails application. If I go to something that doesn't exist, this is just the default Rails 404 message. Right, so it just gets rendered for us. I can also do things like in my routing file, I can add constraints to a route. So I can say constraint, let me see if it's done in here because I always forget. Is it constraint or constraints? Let's try constraint. You can do things like specify that the ID needs to be numeric. How we do this, I'm going to have to cheat and go look at a repository that I've worked with recently. You can see the routing file can get big. Oh, it's constraints. And so here I can specify a constraint on the ID and pass it a regular expression saying that IDs can only be numeric values. /d means some numeric value, plus means one or more. So here I'm saying there's a constraint on this route. Don't even try to route something like /task/woot, only route /task/number. So if I now go back to my thing here, 4 still causes a problem because there is no ID called 4. 3 still works, but woot, there's no route for that. There's a routing error. In production mode, again, this would also trigger a 404, but that way you're sort of just making sure that you don't even get weird data going into your controller. You don't even try to route to something that isn't a numeric value. And so now we can see that that has allowed us to load up individual tasks. The very last thing I'm going to do is I'd like to link to each one of these tasks from the index. So there is no /task. It's at the route. For each one of these, I'd like these to be a link that actually links to that individual page for those tasks. And so I go to my index, and instead of echoing out the task description, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Rails helper. And the helper is called link to. And what the helper does is it builds URLs for us, or it builds actually hrefs for us. It's going to build a link for us. So we don't manually build the link. What we do is we say link to. The first parameter is what the link's going to say, like what the link's going to read, what's going to be the content of the A element. And the second is what we wish to link to. In this case, we wish to link to the task, this task here. This may or may not work. I may have to also alter my routing file slightly. Let's see. Yeah, I need to give it. So what it's telling me is undefined method task path. And so if I look over here at my routing, oh, where am I? This is the one where I had the routing happening. When I defined this route, there was no prefix. And I can add a prefix by going to the routing file and not doing that. But instead, naming the route. I can say as task. Once I've given the route a name, if I reran my rake routes command, we would see that it had a prefix of task. And then what happens is when this link to command happens and we ask it for a link to a particular task, Rails is automatically going to say, well, there must be a task path. And now that I've defined something called task in my routing file, the link to will just look to my routes. So routes work both ways. Routes not only work by taking URLs in and mapping them to controller actions, they also work to allow us to automatically build links to particular actions within our website. So here I'm saying link to the description, link to this particular task. In the back end, it's going to try to load up something called a task path, which it now exists because I've named my route as task. And so if I go back to here, I now have links to each one of those pages. This one links appropriately to done for the day. This one links appropriately to the tasks number 1. This one links appropriately to, so they link properly to that show page by way of naming the route appropriately, and then using the link to actually link to that particular task. Yes, we could have done this manually. So yes, we could have done this and said href equals, then echo in the task description here inside of the A, and then inside of the href we could have manually said /task/ and then again echo manually in the task ID. That should still take me to the proper place for each one of them. It's a lot more work though, right? So we have to sort of manually do this. And the other thing is that the routing can change. Like, what if my boss comes to me and says, oh, wait, we don't want to publicly call them tasks anymore. We want to call them gophers. And so we could just change this route to /gophers. And now on my index page, done for the day, the top route that's generated by link to properly goes to gophers, number 3, without me having to change that line at all. Like, I didn't have to go in and change this link to at all, even though now I'm referring to a gophers URL, but my hard-coded one is now broken, right? Because it's hard-coded in this word task, which will not work anymore. So if I try to go to one of the task ones, it'll say there's no route for that. And so that's why we don't try to build these things manually. We ask the routing file what the URL is, because our routes are flexible. We can change our routes at any time. And I can change it back to tasks, and the application still works. So we're done for the day. I'll do my final commit in GitHub. Added the show action /view with links from the index. I can push that up to GitHub. So now you can all go to GitHub and you can, I don't know, my password won't be in there anymore, but you can see the code that I've produced today, and we'll just sort of continue with this next time. Any final questions before we're done? Okay, I'm going to stop the screencast.